The Home Depot and Lowe's are two of the largest sellers of lumber and lumber products in the country. In fact, in 2023, they sold a combined $18 billion worth of lumber. With all of that lumber being bought and sold, they have a pretty good idea as to where the market is and where it's going. And in this video, I'm going to tell you what they're saying, so stick around. Both Lowe's and the Home Depot recently held their earnings calls for 2023. This is where they describe their performance for the last year and talk about challenges as well as opportunities. It's also time for industry analysts to ask the CEO, CFO, and other executives questions about their business. In both calls, there was discussion on lumber prices and where they think those lumber prices are headed. And so let's first start with Home Depot and talk about what they said. Now, one of the things that Home Depot talked a lot about on their call was what they call lumber deflation. Now, I think that we're all pretty well familiar with inflation, but deflation is really just the opposite. Instead of prices going up, their prices coming down. Now, in a normal economy, deflation doesn't really happen all that often. But in this case, we're not talking about deflation in the entire economy. We're talking about deflation of lumber prices, or the prices that came down from the historic highs that they were the past couple of years, which were frankly ridiculous. In fact, at its peak, I snapped these pictures of 2x4s that cost $9.52 and 4x8 sheets of OSB that cost over $65. Now, here's what Home Depot had to say about that.
Deflation from core commodity categories negatively impacted our average ticket by 35 basis points during the fourth quarter, driven by deflation in lumber and copper wire. During the fourth quarter, we continue to see, on average, a decline in lumber prices relative to a year ago. However, framing and panel lumber pricing experienced the most stable pricing levels during the quarter in some time.
Now, there's always a bit of jargon on these calls, and they can sometimes be hard to understand. But in this case, basically what he is saying is that the decrease in prices of both lumber and copper led to smaller sales overall. But he did say that panel lumber pricing was a little bit more stable, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, I personally have seen that myself. I track lumber prices and even have a lumber prices tracker on my website where people can submit prices to me from all over the country. What I can say is that lumber prices have declined from their highs. Even though it may not feel like it, it has happened. And we're now trading at something much more reasonable. 2x4s are actually pretty close to pre-pandemic prices, but sheet goods are easily double what they were before 2020. And that's kind of what he was talking about in that comment, is that sheet good prices are a little more stable. And that basically means the prices are still high. Now, they mentioned this lumber price deflation a few more times on the call, and they discussed how it negatively impacted their bottom line. Now, generally, if a retailer is moving through product quickly enough, gradual changes in prices are really not much of a concern. The challenge, however, is if sales volume decreases and prices also decrease, and those happen in extreme amounts very quickly. In that case, what happens is you're stuck with a product, lumber in this case, that you paid a high price for which you now cannot sell at that high price and have to sell at a lower price. That's definitely going to impact your bottom line, and that's partially what Home Depot saw. Later in the call, there was a question from an analyst at Morgan Stanley, and here's what he had to ask.
Can we ask about the shape of the year? You lapped the lumber deflation in the first part of the year, maybe some weather. So that should be better, but the second half is in theory post-interest rate cuts, and maybe durables get a little bit better. So how should we think about it?
Again, these guys speak in jargon, but basically what he's doing is he's asking them to give him an idea of where they expect the lumber market to be this year. And here is how the CFO answered that question.
Yeah, so Simeon, the lumber was actually a function more of a comparison to 2022 in 2023. If you compare the lumber charts, I'd encourage you to pull it up. Lumber prices were relatively steady across 2023, so we don't really see a material impact to 2024. With respect to 24, first we expect a normal seasonal curve for our business. So there's really no seasonal shift in how we think about the halves. We anticipate the second half coming in slightly better than the first half, with both being negative, at least as implied in our guidance. It might help to recall the halves for 2023 were relatively in line with one another.
So he talks about lumber charts. So let's actually pull up one of these charts for the past few years. This is a chart of lumber futures, and here you can see that prices did calm down in 2023 and remained relatively stable. What he's saying here is that he expects that to continue in 2024 with perhaps some seasonal adjustments. But he did say that he anticipated the second half coming in slightly better, meaning that he expects lumber prices to go up slightly in the second half of the year. So what do you guys think about that? Do you agree with his assessment? Do you think the prices are going to go up in the later part of the year? Where do you think lumber is headed? Leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts. All right, so that is the Home Depot. Let's check out what Lowe's has to say. Here is a brief comment from the CFO of Lowe's. Also, just for reference, in this comment, he uses the term comp sales. That just means that they're comparing their current sales figures to the sales figures from the previous period. So if their comps are lower, they did worse. If their comps are higher, they did better than they did in the last period. All right, here's what he had to say.
Comp sales were down 6.2%, driven by continued pressure in DIY, bigger ticket spending, and unfavorable January winter weather. Lumber deflation did not have a material impact on comp sales.
So it is a really brief comment, but basically what Lowe's is saying here is that lumber deflation did not have a significant impact on their sales as compared with the previous period. And that's it. That's all that Lowe's said about lumber on their call, which is really different from previous years when they actually talked about it quite a bit. So it's interesting to me that the Home Depot mentioned lumber deflation a lot, and Lowe's didn't seem to consider lumber deflation a significant problem at all. And to understand that, let's actually look at the lumber sales comps for both Lowe's and Home Depot for the last year. So in 2022, Lowe's sold $9.7 billion in lumber, and in 2023, they sold a little over $7 billion. That's a decrease of 28%, pretty significant. For Home Depot in 2022, they sold almost $13.5 billion in lumber, and then in 2023 they sold $11.7 billion, which is a decrease of 13%. So if the decrease for Home Depot was less than the decrease for Lowe's, why does Home Depot complain and say that it affected their comps, but Lowe's doesn't have that same complaint? Now, honestly, I have no idea. The only thing that I can think is that perhaps Lowe's had better wholesale prices of lumber, and so because of that, they weren't as impacted by the prices falling or that lumber deflation, but they were rather just impacted by lower sales due to lower demand. Now, I'm not sure if that's the case, but the one thing that this does tell us is that lumber sales are down across the board. High prices did their thing. People stopped buying as much, and so because of that, those prices have actually come down. The big question is whether it's going to last, or whether, like what Home Depot thinks, prices will come up later in the year. All right, so I hope that you found this video interesting. If you did, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. If you want to know my thoughts on where lumber is headed, you can check out this video here that I posted recently. Or if you're interested in my DIY projects, check out this playlist here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.